Where really is the disconnect? To answer that, I'm joined by my regular contributor, Professor John George Akoya, who of course is an expert in this field, having studied the Masters in Immigration and Refugee Law from the University of London and of course the University of Baltimore in the United States. Karibu sana, Prof.
Thank you, thank you.
And thank you once again for gracing us with your presence tonight.
Thank you, thank you.
Let us get this right off the bat, Prof. And when we talk about refugees, what does it mean? What is the legal definition of a refugee?
There are many definitions, but I'll go by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which is based in Geneva. Article 2 of the convention states as follows. It says that a refugee is a person who is outside his country of origin because of persecution, either by the state or the agent, in the following manner. It's like they cannot avail themselves for protection internally or within the country. And for that, for one to get into the threshold of refugee, the person must have a well-founded fear and of persecution for reasons of race, religion, political opinion, membership of a particular social group, and cannot return to his country of origin. Now, when you come to CEDAW Convention, which sat sometimes back in Canada, they also came up with a proposition that women could qualify as refugees because of domestic violence. So domestic violence is a criteria that has also been uplifted to meet the threshold where women, especially from Islamic countries, who are in a relationship of either active or potentially polygamous marriage. Active when somebody has more than one wife, potentially when there's a likelihood of a person marrying more than two wives, in which case under Islamic law and countries that embrace Sharia law, there is always a presumption that either the likelihood of a man marrying up to 4 wives comes in. And because of thematic domestic abuse for a very, very long time, the Refugee Council was convinced by CEDAW Convention, by the CEDAW Convention on the Elimination of any kind of discrimination against women, to come to raise the bar that women also qualified under the convention.
Very well, Prof. And what about an asylum seeker? I understand there's a difference between a refugee and somebody seeking asylum.
Yes, I would look at it comparatively, because when you look at comparative immigration law and also look at refugee law, which is an arm of immigration law, we will find out that in a country like UK, US, they have categorized the status of refugee in the following manner. When you are a newly arrived person and you're claiming asylum either in your country through the embassy or you found your way out, and doesn't matter how you travel, you can travel on somebody's passport, there's case law to that. You find yourself in another country and you claim refugee, then you cannot actually be categorized as a refugee. You become categorized as an asylum seeker, and you must be processed, and the process is very rigorous, going through the interviews, security interviews, and what have you, so that you can meet the threshold of a well-founded fear. And this was actually related into a case known as Sivakumaran, which came up with what we call objective and subjective fear in the House of Lords decision. So more or less, this definition of asylum or asylee, asylum seeker or asylee as it is called, one becomes an asylee after he has actually made the threshold. And then he has to stay for a certain period of time, during which he's not allowed to go to his country of origin. He has no travel documents and cannot leave the country until he actually reaches the status of a proper definition of a refugee. And once you become a refugee, then now you are handed over to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and you are within a protected borders of international refugee law. You don't become a subject of the state that has accorded you asylum, that has recognized you a refugee. So anything that you do which does not make you obligated to the domestic criminal code of that particular country, that means violating the law, then you are within the precincts of the United Nations protection, and you are protected by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
Interesting indeed, but let us look at you now as a person and 2 master's degrees in matters to do with immigration and refugees. Why did you decide to take it upon yourself and delve deeper into this matter, Prof?
I have more than 5 masters, and I'm doing my 2nd doctorate right now. It's not bragging, but that's the truth, because I was a refugee myself.
A refugee yourself?
Yes. When I left this country, fear of persecution after I had been persecuted, after I had been put in jail. And you must also know that I have a background of a chokora. I was a street boy here, brought up by J.J. Kamodo. And fate had it that after Form 6, I didn't qualify to go to the university here. So I joined the police, became a police officer, and things happened that I cannot actually reveal right now, but my book will be coming in. Then I found myself in UK, where I became an asylum seeker, went through the threshold, and while I was there, as a grave digger and a security guard, I did realize that it was important for me to look into the plight of fellow refugees or asylum seekers who are arriving in the country. And we became the pioneers of this area of law, which was actually very new at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Actually, it was initially classified as an anthropological subject. It was within the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. So we came out as pioneers, and we became the first group to study Masters of Law degree in Refugee Law. And then from there we expanded, and that's why I later on joined other lawyers, and I started my own refugee practice, immigration practice in the UK. And I got experience, and later on I crossed the Atlantic, where I also practice immigration. But must also put a footnote on this, that Kenyans always do the best wherever they are. And I was classified as one of the best immigration lawyers in the UK in tandem with the European law. So it's something that I'm very much conversant with.
So if we have, according to UNHCR, they say that we have about 500,000 documented refugees in the country. Of course, I understand we have even more undocumented, making the number close to about 1.2 million refugees in Kenya today. What are the rights of refugees? Are they allowed to work in Kenya? Can they vote? Can they do these other things?
Kenya is one of those countries on the red line. Kenya is one of the countries that does not really look into the plight of refugees. As a matter of fact, Kenya has been #1 abuse of refugee law and refugee rights right from the beginning. If you look at the post-apartheid era, the number of South Africans who came to seek refuge here were actually deported automatically. There is also a time when Kenyans had this policy that looked upon refugees as people who are not full human beings. And that is seen with the way they were violating the United Nations Convention under the old constitution, where asylum seekers were classified and deported. And that's what Matiang'i is doing today, just rounding up people because of some mediocre policy, which we do not know how one-man decision can lead to a violation of the UNHCR regulation, where the man just comes and says, we don't care how you came in. You arrest these people, round them up, and take them to their country. And that really bleeds my heart. Looking at the Minister for Internal Security, abusing the law, international law, he himself having not, under any circumstances, become a refugee. Maybe he went outside the country to study and came back and didn't know the plight of refugees. I was a grave digger myself, and I knew what I went through as a refugee in the UK. And that's why I'm really very interested. And that's why I've started the first immigration law firm in this country, so that we can create awareness. How do you come up with autocratic principle and just abuse rights that have been recognized internationally?
So if I'm a refugee today and I happen to come into the borders of Kenya today, what is the procedure for me to become a documented refugee?
Well, if you look at the Refugee Act that we have today, which is really draconian, which in itself doesn't have guidelines and principles, you'll find out that refugees have been relegated to UNHCR.
Okay.
The government does not look into the plight of refugees. It has refused to give information through education. It has none of even an academic institution, apart from Dr. Gitome at Kenyatta University, who has come up with a proposition of teaching refugees in tandem with the Canadian non-governmental organization. The government has not come up with a clear-cut policy. They don't recognize refugees. According to the Immigration Act 1971 in the United Kingdom, it says, it lays down the parameters of one obtaining British citizenship, either through marriage, through work-related permit, or through refugee. But in Kenya, it's very difficult, even though the law is very clear that if somebody comes in and wants to become a Kenyan citizen, the Immigration Act talks of the ceiling of the 7 years, but also they do the negation 7 years continuously. Mm-hmm. Now, if you came in as a visitor, for example, and a visitor's pass, and you fall in love with a Kenyan, and the law requires you to remain to be here continuously for 7 years. Mm-hmm. What happens if you are given 6 months, which can be renewed once? Do you need to break the chain of leaving the country to Uganda and then you come back? Then when will you start again that 7-year period? Mm-hmm. We are lacking policy on that. Mm-hmm. The government ought to have come up with a policy which says that if you leave temporarily, then that within a certain perimeter of time, then that does not count as. For example, in UK, if you live in the UK and you leave the UK for more than 485 days, mm-hmm. that breaks the chain of you applying for citizenship in the UK until you have now to come back again and stay for a certain duration. Mm-hmm. But in Kenya, there's no clear cut. People have applied for citizenship in this country. That has not come into fruition. People do not even know how their permanent resident application are. Mm-hmm. But refugee can also do the same. But can they really try? There are no guidelines. So the system here and the immigration law needs reform, but at the same time it's very abusive. Mm-hmm. Because one, the Council of Legal Education has not legitimized the teaching of immigration law in universities. Mm-hmm. Number two, the Kenya School of Law does not look at issues of immigration and asylum. In Europe and America, immigration law alone is the widest subject that lawyers just specialize in it because mm-hmm. it has family derivative applications, it has work-oriented, labor certification, corporate, commercial-oriented kind of investment. Okay. So and also criminal. Mm-hmm. We don't also have a criminal code to criminalize immigration, where if somebody is arrested in this country under immigration, under immigration offense, he's actually penalized under the penal code. Okay,
but Prof, yes. We've seen with the advancement of the Organization of African Unity, now African Union, and of course with the advancement of the East African business doing close links with each other, we've seen an influx of refugees coming into the country. And as you're saying, we should welcome and embrace refugees. But with the non-existent or the weak law, does it mean that we are at risk of bringing in foreign people who could actually come in and harm us as a country? Because we understand that a few months ago there was plans to shut down the Dadaab for terror-related reasons. So what do we need to work on? Is it the policy, is it the law, or where really is the problem?
The problem is still Matiang'i. Mm-hmm. Matiang'i is one of the best human beings I've come across, even though he's a bit of a bully when it comes to issues of refugees. Mm-hmm. If he wants, he can constitute a team of experts mm-hmm. to help him come up with some kind of legislation, or if we can have a lobby group that can go to Parliament to ask Parliament to sit down and do some kind of legislation. Because if we close Dadaab like it was, which was a political statement from the Deputy President, a single human individual wanting to mess up the lives of millions of Kenyans, of refugees who have actually been born here and have lived here for the rest of their lives. And then you come up and then you say, because of political considerations, we have to close the camp and take these people away. Let me tell you this. I'm willing to lobby the UNCHR mm-hmm. and the United Nations High Human Rights Commission in the in New York to actually put sanctions on some of these politicians. They are very literate when it comes to international affairs. Mm-hmm. They want to do things to please themselves at the expense of the world. The UNCHR, as well as the international community, put in a lot of money for the welfareism of refugees. Okay. And it's up to the government to come and actually set the bar, follow into the footsteps of countries like United Kingdom, Canada, United States, and European countries, so that they can come up with a law which can enhance human rights.
But Prof, if you say we have been violating the international code when it comes to refugees and we have been mistreating refugees, why haven't we seen bodies like the UNHCR coming up in arms and actually taking action and give sanctions, as you say, towards Kenya?
I teach international law. I teach international law to my students. Right now, I'm actually teaching on master's level. And the first subject I studied was immigration law. We have the principles of sovereignty of a state, and non-interference of domestic affairs of a state. So because of the equality principle, where it is actually, which interrogates that all countries are equal, it will be very difficult because international law does not have one parliament. It does not have one policing. It is an issue of persuasion through bilaterally or multilaterally. And when it comes to international law, under the new constitution, Article 2.6 is very clear. It brings it in as long as the law has been signed. So what we need to look at the moment is where do we start from now? And how do we move on from now to educate our fellow Kenyans, especially those in the government who do not even know what is going on, so that we can actually harmonize relationship with the international community and give cognizance to refugees.
Bottom line, so how should we as Kenyans look at refugees? Should we look at them as people who need help, or should we look at them as a burden to the nation?
I was a refugee in the United Kingdom. 26 years I stayed there. They gave me shelter. They protected me. I was able to work. It doesn't matter which kind of work I did. I did not discriminate. I had no choice. I was a grave digger for 7 years. I was a security guard during that time to complement while I was raising a young family. And I was allowed freely to go to school and study. The onus was on me to go to school and prove myself. And then I was actually given permanent resident in the United Kingdom. I was given another permanent resident in the US. That kind of harmonization is what made me. That kind of harmonization is what made some of these leaders you see in Southern Africa who are fighting during the liberation struggle. It's what made the Sudanese government stand where it is today, because almost everybody in Sudan who is over 30 years was in exile. So why can't we Kenyans also look at these people with humane? Because you never know today. I've seen a Kenyan minister from Kisii, an ex-Kenyan minister who became a refugee in the United States. He's cleaning dishes. He tells me whenever I meet him in Minnesota that if he had only known, then he could have actually stabilized harmonization of the law to protect refugees.
Okay. Professor George Wajakoya, thank you very much. We understand that you've been in court today and yesterday. Would you mind maybe talk about who you're representing in the Sharon Otieno murder case? I'm
keeping my cards very close to my chest, and I'm still just observing what the drama that is going on in court.
Okay.
Then when I come out, I'll come out fully, and by that time, then maybe we shall talk.
Professor George Wajakoya there highlighting us the importance of holding refugees dear to our hearts right here in the country at that particular point in time. Thank you very much, Prof. We want to take a very short break. When we come back, we'll have the latest in the world of business. Stay with us.